Good evening. This is my Tuesday talk, a short word, building on, adding to, and sometimes springboarding off of whatever direction we happen to be moving on Sunday during the sermon. So this past Sunday, May the 31st, the specific focus of the message was on Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 through 24. Based on that passage, the habit among the Pharisees and the scribes to, as we said in the message, major in the minors, to be a penny wise and a pound foolish, to metaphorically, as Jesus said, carefully strain out a tiny dead bug, a gnat floating in a drink, while readily swallowing down a dead camel carcass floating in exactly the same drink. It was ultimately a message about not losing sight of what is of the utmost importance. And Paul identifies what is of the utmost importance as the message of salvation through the substitutionary death of Christ and the spread of that message to those who have not yet heard it or not yet accepted it. However, I spoke more broadly, albeit more briefly, about the entirety of the Lord's withering, and it can only be described as withering, denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees that extends over the whole length of Matthew chapter 23, all 37 verses. There's a series of scathing woes that he pronounced on them. And I want to focus just briefly on those. I want to revisit that overall reproof, and especially the fact that these men, these scribes and Pharisees, they furnish us with yet another cautionary tale, a story or an account that puts us on alert or delivers to us a warning. In all, Matthew records Jesus calling the Pharisees and the scribes hypocrites no less than 12 times. But fully six of those remarks are in the 23rd chapter. The word that's used is translated, and it describes an actor or a stage player, a deceiver who pretends and thereby deceives. So when Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites, he was saying to them, you know what, you're a bunch of religious actors, you're a bunch of deceivers, a bunch of religious pretenders. Now, to wrap our minds fully around the cautionary element of the warning tied up in their story, we need to understand something about the Pharisaical movement and the work of the scribes. You see, they didn't begin in the tragic place that they ended. They actually started from a very good place. The Jewish people had strayed far from God. And after repeated attempts through the prophets to turn them aside from the downward spiral that they were on, all of which they spurned, by the way, God finally brought out the big gun that he had warned them of repeatedly. And he unleashed the Babylonian Empire on Judah to conquer the Jewish nation and to carry much of the surviving population off into captivity in a foreign land. So the Jewish people ended up enduring or being subjected to an exile, to a forced detention in pagan Babylon. Now God allowed that so that his people would be jolted through the adversity or through the loss of everything that had been dear to them, so that it turned their collective heart back to him and back to his way. Well, eventually it worked. And in time, God restored the nation to their homeland. And then that's when the Pharisees and the scribes enter into the life and history of the Jewish people. You see, these fellows and their movement arose out of a desire to safeguard the nation against a recurrence of the waywardness that had led to the Babylonian captivity, and thus in turn to safeguard against that kind of thing or that degree of chastisement being necessary again in the life of the nation. So in the beginning, the mission of the Pharisees and the scribes was to guide the nation into a sustained or an enduring faithfulness to God, into diligently following his ways. Their goal was to keep the Jewish people pure and holy and spiritually on track. So at its outset, theirs was a thumbs-up movement. It was a positive initiative. It was driven and shaped by great motives and had a great purpose in mind. However, the thing is, while the adage, what begins well, ends well, is sometimes true, it is certainly not a binding law of the universe. In fact, that maxim can have the deleterious or detrimental effect of putting us off guard and dangerously at ease. And what began well among the Pharisees and scribes certainly didn't end well. Over time, their motives shifted and devolved. Over time, their movement lost touch with its original mission objective. And there are 7 things in particular that pop up or are evident among them. First of all, instead of remaining focused on keeping people in a close relationship with God, they became focused on controlling people's behavior. You know, in this matter, they ended up placing the cart in front of the horse, or to put it another way, they had begun allowing the tail to wag the dog. They eventually forgot that right behavior flows from a right relationship to and is sustained in the context of a vital experience with God rather than the other way around. And history bears out, or it demonstrates repeatedly, that a focus on behavior over relationship is a hallmark of dead religiosity over against a living faith and a vital, flowing experience with God. The second thing that happened was that they began to build ridiculous rules and regulations on top of God's law. And that devolved into them turning into a religious police force committed to enforcement. Third, in the wake of the above 2 things, they naturally, and maybe inevitably, became self-righteous. They became elitist, puffed up by a sense of their own moral superiority. And then, fourth, acquiring influence and power, both religious and political, they eventually became contemptuous and abusive of many, many people, Jews and non-Jews alike, upon whom they looked down. You see, self-righteousness, all self-righteousness, is a form of arrogance and self-importance. And all arrogant and self-important people are abusers of those that they believe to be less than themselves. Inevitably, somehow that pattern shows up. Number 5, their message became characterized by strict legalism, empty or devoid of all love, all grace, and all mercy. And 6, from that, their legalistic message began to foster an inappropriate and unhealthy fear of God. Now, fear of the Lord that expresses itself as deep respect or regard for God that's so profound that it leaves you loath to transgress against Him, well, that's biblical fear of God. On the other hand, fear of God that causes people to see Him as malignant or capricious or temperamental, one that has to be lived in abject terror or dread of, that's not biblical. And it's that latter unscriptural fear of the Lord that the Pharisees and the scribes had sunken into becoming the purveyors of. They were the traffickers of dread. And number 7, and worst of all, like Jesus repeatedly said, they became hypocrites. They became religious pretenders, spiritual actors. They were fakers of the first magnitude. Jesus made this especially clear when He described them as whited sepulchres full of dead men's bones. On the outside, they looked nice, shiny, pretty, attractive. But on the inside, there was death, decay, rot, and corruption. You may have heard of the Taj Mahal, seen pictures of it. Maybe you've even been able to visit it. And the Taj Mahal is regarded the world over as one of the most beautiful man-made structures on the planet. But do you realize what it is? It's a tomb. It was built by a king for a deceased wife. It's a house of death. As beautiful it is, it's an elaborate container for decay, rot, and corruption. So, like the Pharisees, shiny on the inside, but ugly on the shiny on the outside, but ugly on the inside. As I mentioned before, there's things to be learned. This is a cautionary tale, and there are lessons to take away from the tragic story of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. For example, beware if you begin deliberately leading an outer life that is a false representation of your inner life. A beautiful outer life that is deliberately constructed to mask a not so pretty inner life. Beware if you, find yourself, buckling down to pressure to create a perception that you've got it all together spiritually. Don't fall into the trap of trying to look confident all the time or sound as if you've got all of the answers or that you're closer to God than you actually are. That you've got a spiritual walk that is worthy to be modeled by others, but maybe you know that it isn't. When this happens, we become actors. We become pretenders. We become fakes and hypocrites like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And you know what happens? Pretenders end up turning people away from the real thing. No one will follow a fake very long. People crave substance over, form. And sooner or later, when, substance is missing, they sniff it out. And eventually they spot the fake. And when they do, they'll not only be potentially alienated from you, but alienated from God. So what damage, tremendous damage, hypocrisy can do. And that's what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing, among the people of Israel. So what's the alternative to being a hypocrite? Is it perfection? No. The alternative to being a hypocrite is simply being real. No one trusts a hypocrite, but people have an unusual confidence in a person who is real and transparent about their inner messy inner life rather. It takes courage to show people what's behind the mask. You have to run a risk to let people know what your struggles and your doubts and your imperfections are. But there's an even greater reward in authenticity, especially when it comes to the impact that you or I can have on people for Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to be clear on something. What I have said is not a license to live like you please. We're still expected to resolve to walk worthy of the Lord and to please Him in all things, and to rely on grace and the inner working of the Holy Spirit to succeed in that. But as you do, you're going to stumble. You're going to fall. But when you do, just be real and be humble about it. Don't put on a front. Don't be a pretender or a spiritual poser like the Pharisees and the scribes were. And when we, learn these lessons from the tragic story of a movement or a group that began well but ended not so well, as we learn these lessons, we can become an enduring and compelling representative for Christ in the world. And after all, that's what's utmost. That's what's of the utmost importance. That we represent the Christ who died for all men. God bless you.